This is Denise Gwen reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 in the Medicine Women of Alaska. Chapter 1. Gnometown, Alaska. What in the world is that girl doing? Drew fumed. Nurse Phyllis sidled up beside him. Why, Dr. Rutherford, I do believe she's planting flowers in a flower box. Shocking, I know. You're a smartass, ain't you? Takes one to know one. Then, in a serious tone, she added, "That's the new doctor who's taken over the bakery that closed down." Drew turned to look at her. That girl? She's not just any girl, Dr. Rutherford. She's a board-certified, medically trained physician. Thanks for that. Don't mention it. Nurse Phyllis smirked and returned to her desk. Drew turned to gaze at his father's nurse. This lady, who'd worked at this practice during his father's tenure, was really his nurse now, and this was his medical practice. He looked out the window again and massaged his temples. I hate all the changes I'm seeing around here. There's been a massive amount of construction. It shouldn't surprise any of us that a new doctor wants to set out her shingle. Nurse Phyllis shuffled some papers, then answered a phone call. Drew shoved his hands in the front pockets of his jeans and rolled back on his heels. Good for this pretty young lady who decided to set up her shingle. But the prospect of a new doctor in town bothered him a lot more than he cared to let on. Your brother Paul's a doctor too, you know. Drew scowled with derision. True, his older brother was a licensed physician, but he didn't care to be trapped, his words, not Drew's, in the practice day in and day out. He preferred to be out on the mountains, tracking bears or saving hapless tourists. He had zero interest in preserving the legacy of the Rutherford name, a family name that may very well come to an end if this new doctor set up her shingle in his town. He opened the door and stood on the front stoop with his arms crossed over his chest. He'd once been the only doctor in this small fishing village. When he first joined his father's practice, his dad had promised that he only needed Drew part-time. But then Dad got sick, and Drew ended up running the practice alone. Then, to everyone's surprise, a big-wig developer from Los Angeles arrived and announced his intention to build a ski resort and medical spa on the tallest mountain just outside of town. It disturbed the grizzly population, but the developer didn't care. He wanted his ski resort and spa. Activity across the street cut Drew's musings short. The pretty young doctor appeared to have the plants arranged to her satisfaction. She dusted off her hands and straightened up. She put her hands on her bottom and leaned back with a feline grace. Drew watched, mesmerized, as she lifted her slender arms high over her head and stretched. He drank her in, every ounce of her. Her strawberry blonde hair, which she'd pulled back into a low ponytail, glowed in the lovely bright morning. How in the world did he fail to notice her arrival? At that moment, his older brother Paul strode across the street, heading directly to him. Paul loped along, kitted out for a trek up a mountain. He wore heavy leather boots, a thick jacket, and wool gloves. A pickaxe dangled from one of the empty jeans loops. He looked filthy. He smiled up at Drew and tapped him on the shoulder as he sidled past. Drew chuckled. "You'd better wrap up that rope before you set foot inside Phyllis's nice clean waiting room, or she'll chop you up into pieces." "Ha," Paul said, but he hoisted the rope onto his right shoulder, coiled it up, and stuffed it into his haversack. Drew spared the pretty lady doctor one last lingering look, then went inside. Paul stood in the snug waiting room, grinning at him. "Caught you staring at that pretty lady doctor." "The heck you did," Drew returned evenly. "You want me to introduce you?" Paul asked. Drew started with surprise. "How do you know her?" Phyllis burst into the waiting room and marched up to Paul, wagging her finger. "Paul, did you even pretend to scrape the dirt off that pickaxe of yours before you stomped into my pristine waiting room?" "Howdy, Phyllis," Paul drawled. She fisted her hands on her hips. "You're leaving bits and pieces of dirt all over the floor. You'd better grab the vacuum, young man, and get to work." "Sure thing, Philly," Paul said, referring to the austere nurse by his favorite nickname. And again, Drew was struck by his brother's familiarity with her. Drew had been working at his dad's clinic for going on 5 years now, and he'd yet to achieve the kind of easy jocularity that his brother enjoyed with her. "Get that pickaxe out of my waiting room this instant, Dr. Paul, or I'll slice off your head and serve it up on a platter." "Won't that get kind of messy, Philly?" "Dr. Paul?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll take the pickaxe outside and chip off the dirt before I come back in." "Something that you ought to have done before you even walked in." A wry smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. Paul winked at Drew and jerked his head for him to follow him back outside. As he chipped the dirt off his pickaxe, he jutted his chin toward the new doctor's office. "That's Dr. Naomi Schuster." "Okay." How in the world did his itinerant mountain man of a brother make the new doctor's acquaintance when he was not 100 yards away from her and hadn't yet met her? Paul continued his narrative. "I met her last night, introduced myself. I wouldn't give her a second's thought, though. She's a cold fish, man, let me tell you." "I'll bet she took offense at your easy manner," Drew said dryly. Paul's romantic exploits were legendary. He dated every available woman in Gnometown and the surrounding 200-mile radius, leaving a trail of broken hearts in his wake. He'd obviously attempted his wiles on the new doctor, only to be soundly rebuffed. It reassured Drew to know that at least one woman had resisted his older brother's charms. Then again, Paul hadn't cracked the brittle veneer of Drew's former wife, Daniel Rutherford, either. "That should be clean enough, even for Nurse Phyllis's standards," Paul said, and the brothers retreated to Drew's office at the back of the building. Drew settled down behind his desk. "So, where are you off to with this pickaxe?" "Taking some surveyors out into the woods. Thought I'd drop in for some medical supplies. After they get their dumb butts mauled by a grizzly, are you going to save their lives?" "You're such a cynic, little brother. I've come by it honestly." "Now, about this pretty new doctor," Paul began. I'm not concerned with her looks, Drew said. I don't want her presence to threaten the family practice. Paul shrugged, and Drew fought back a flare of anger. Paul's apathy toward the family practice singed Drew's heart. Their grandfather and their father had worked hard to build up the medical practice, and Drew was the only one who cared. Only, are you sure you really care, Drew? Drew pulled off his bifocals and pinched the bridge of his nose. Aren't you opposed to that ski resort? I am, but there's not a whole lot either of us can do about it, is there? You didn't show up for any of the planning committee meetings. Paul snorted with anger, and Drew said nothing further. Paul doesn't care about a lot of things, and it's kind of troubling. Paul changed the subject. Anyway, just thought I'd drop into town, check in on my brother, and see if he's scoping out the new competition. I'll worry about her later, Drew said. I wouldn't be surprised if you start losing some of your patients to the cute new doctor. Drew bristled. What makes you say that? The local kids are scared of you. From what I hear, the Darjeeling twins think you're evil incarnate. Those girls spooked my horse with their nutty behavior. You're terrible with children. I am not. Paul smirked. Don't be surprised if Mrs. Darjeeling comes in and asks for the girls' medical records. Must be nice for you, Drew said bitterly. You get to take off for the mountains without a care in the world. He knew the instant he'd spoken these words, he'd crossed a line. Paul answered him with a stony silence. You know my reasons, Drew. Drew envied his older brother's freedom. Paul had his own secret sorrows, but he appeared to lead an easy, uncompromising life. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, while Drew became the son who could be depended on. Dependable, reliable, safe. He wished... Well, Paul said at last, I better get going. All right. Hey, are you okay? Paul asked. I'm fine. Drew waved his hand. Run along then. See ya, bro. Paul disappeared, leaving Drew to his thoughts. Your talents are wasted here, Drew. You made a mistake when you turned down the internship at the Mayo Clinic. Why did you abandon a prestigious surgical residency to live in this humdrum little town and be a general practitioner? Daniel Rutherford's dunning words rang in his head. For the longest time, he'd blocked out the sea of negative words, but he'd slowly started to drown in regrets. Did he make a mistake by setting down stakes here? And now a new ski lodge with an attached hospital was arriving, not to mention the new doctor in the neighborhood. He hated to admit it, but he felt threatened in a way he'd never experienced before. Was Danielle right? Was he wasting his life? Should he have said no when his dad asked him to take over the practice? Oh, it was so hard to make that kind of a decision. A tap at the door brought him back to the present. Yes, he called out. The door opened and Nurse Phyllis peeked in. Hey, Drew said pleasantly. What's going on? She fetched a heavy sigh. I'm so sorry, Dr. Rutherford, but Mrs. Darjeeling's in the waiting room. What's the problem? She gazed at him with agonized eyes. Mrs. Darjeeling isn't here for an appointment, Dr. Rutherford. She's asking to transfer the twins' charts to the new medical practice.